Let the young ones go ahead and be dismissed to begin our church this morning. I love having the kids in here for the singing, hearing their voices, and hearing truth. Amen. James 1:12-18 is our text this morning. And as I mentioned, we are looking at this theme that the apostle has concerning enduring trials in our life. Anybody have a trial? Just out of curiosity, am I preaching to anybody that this rings true with this morning?
Federal or judicial?
What's that?
Federal or judicial?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. I like the local ones, Mike. The federal ones are a mess. All right. Yeah. So, there are those in life who are really bad at taking tests. I don't know if we have anybody in here who back in your student days, you maybe thought you knew the material, or maybe you weren't a bad student, but for some reason, when it came time to taking the test, you always did bad on tests. You were that student who said, I want my grade to be all the homework assignments and the turn-in stuff. I don't want to be the one who half your grade depends on the test at the end. Some people are just like that for whatever reason. Maybe they get nervous, or maybe their brain just kind of short circuits with the pressure, or whatever the case might be. When I was in school, I had a teacher, and I'm trying to remember. I don't remember who the teacher was. I can't place who it was who said this to us. But she tried to get us to think different about testing. I was never nervous about tests. I didn't mind taking them at all. But there were other students who were. And so in trying to get everyone to have this right attitude toward test taking, she said, you don't need to think about a test as something to be scared of taking. A test is a way for you to show what you know, and a way for you to find out what you don't know so that you can learn it. So just think of tests as something good and useful in your life. It shows what you know, and it reveals what you don't know. And then try to have that attitude about it. And I don't know if that attitude, I don't know if anybody listened to her or if it changed the way they thought about it or not. But I thought, I remember thinking, I like that approach. Even though I didn't struggle with taking tests, I thought, I like that she had a different take on taking tests. That was more helpful. Win either way. If I do bad, well, it turns out I didn't know this stuff very well. If I do good, it turns out I did. And in the same sort of vein, the Apostle James is trying to get us to change the way we think about going through trials, because our normal response to going through trials is to dread them, it's to escape them, it's maybe to gripe and complain about them. And instead, James says you're to count it all joy when you encounter trials of various sorts. Instead of trying to escape it, you're to let that trial have its perfect work in your life. You're to let the endurance that is necessary produce in you the fullness of maturity so that you can grow up into Christ. All right, so you can think of your trials as these terrible things that are just there to make your life miserable, or you can have this very counterintuitive, countercultural attitude toward trials that they're producing something valuable in me, and so I'm going to embrace my trials with joy, not because they're pleasurable, but because they're producing something good in me. And so with that attitude in mind, we come down to our text today, where he again talks about the man that is going to endure temptations. Now, one of the tricks of this chapter is understanding what all the words mean. So the word patience, we talked about, has to do with our endurance or our steadfastness. The word here for temptation is not the word for an enticement to sin. And that's a little bit confusing to us because then you get into verses 13 and on, and that word for temptation is the word for enticement to sin. But in verse number 12, the word temptation, blessed is the man that endureth temptation. Well, the word endureth is the word for patience. In verse number 3, the same word, same root word. And then the word for temptation is more like a test. Something that comes to test you in your life. And he says, blessed is the man that endureth temptation, for when he is tried, the word tried really means you've been tried all the way through and been proven. Right? You've gone through the trial, and the verdict is in. So blessed is the man that endures his trials and is found to be steadfast. He's passed his trial. He's passed his test. What's been shown from it is that he's genuinely committed to Christ, even as he faces these kinds of adversity. So, in today's text, what I thought we'd look at is how James now begins to bring a lot more of our thoughts about God into the picture. You know, if you and I are going to go through trials, and we're going to go through trials the right way, and we're going to be steadfast in our trials, it is absolutely imperative that we think correctly, that we think truthfully about the way all of this works. And it's impossible to think truthfully about the way all of this works without thinking true thoughts about God.
Right.
It's really hard to think true thoughts about anything without having true thoughts about God.
Right.
But particularly when you go through trials, whether you are consciously thinking about it or not, I think it is our creaturely nature, and if you're a Christian, of course, it ought to be part of your discipleship, your habits, to always be thinking about God. What is God up to in this? What is God's character like in all of this? And whether we know it or not, one of the things that happens when we go through a trial is it's very easy to have wrong thoughts about God.
Yeah.
It's very easy to begin to think things about God that are not worthy of God. They're lower thoughts, they're baser thoughts, they're thoughts rooted in the lies of Satan and in the infirmity of our flesh. We go all the way back to Genesis and to the early temptation of mankind in the Garden of Eden, and it's all about doubting God and doubting His goodness and doubting His word. And so if we're going to endure trials, we have to think the right thoughts about God, or you're not going to endure.
That's right.
I think a lot of Christians quit because somewhere early on in the trial, they stopped thinking true thoughts about God. But if you can keep your thoughts of God truthful, accurate to who God really is, reflective of God's true character, I think you've got a pretty good shot at going through your trial. Okay? It helps us do that. So there's just two kind of points this morning. If we want to be steadfast in our testings, we have to think these right thoughts about God. And when are we tempted to think wrong thoughts about God? Well, in the midst of that trial, I would say the first thing that James is getting at here, or the first maybe thing that underlies his counsel, is the idea that God is just waiting for me to fail. God is just waiting for me to fail. All right? God doesn't want me to win. God doesn't want me to succeed. If God wanted me to succeed, all this bad stuff wouldn't be happening to me, or people would have been more consistent and more faithful, or circumstances would have turned out more favorably, or that prayer of mine would have been answered. So whether we actually put those things into words or not, we live under this assumption that some way, shape, or form, God really isn't on my side. He's really not rooting for me in the midst of all of this. He's really got something going on where He's decided that He doesn't want me to make it through this one. And that's the way we begin to functionally approach God.
as someone that we sort of have to go to in prayer and get him back on my team. Get him back on my side. God, I don't know where you've been, but really need you. And it's almost as if we have to win him back over. And what that does is it creates this exhaustion in us. All right? It's hard enough to fight against the trial. But if you think that at the same time you're having to win God over to your side, well, that's just absolutely exhausting, isn't it? To try and do that. And so I think a lot of believers quit. They said, well, I tried to get God to help me through that. Well, you're wrong from the start. If you thought you needed to get God on your side, you were off base from the start. Something's going on in your thinking that's not right. So how does that show up in the text? Well, he says, blessed is the man that endureth temptation or trials or testing, because when he has been tried, when he's through his testing, he's going to receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to them that love him. Listen to me, church. God is not waiting for you to fail. He is waiting for you to finish. That is the right way to think about God. God is at the end of the race. He's on the other side of the finish line, and he's waiting to reward those who endure and finish. The picture we have here, this crown of life, by the way, this verse is almost lifted directly out of the teachings of Jesus Christ himself. In Matthew's Gospel, chapter number 10, Jesus is talking about all of those trials that they would go through, his disciples would go through. You shall be hated of all men for my name's sake. But listen to what Jesus says. But he that endureth to the end shall be saved. James says, blessed is the man that endureth trials, temptations. When he's tried, he shall receive the crown of life which the Lord has promised to those that love him. God is waiting to reward you at the end of all of this. All you got to do is make it through. That's your job, to make it to the finish line. Between here and there, there's a lot of stuff. But you're not to quit, because on the other side of the finish line is the reward you've been waiting for. And this is really a beautiful picture that the apostle is painting for the particularly the persecuted church of that day and age, because he uses the word for crown here that's not like the golden crown of the king. He uses the word for crown here that's reflective of what was given to victors in the races, whether it was the Olympic races, whether it was the Isthmian Games in Corinth, whether it was the games and the races that took place in Rome. Each one of them used this crown that they would give the victors. And depending on where you were, that crown was not a gold crown or a silver crown. For those particular races, it was a crown that was woven together out of leaves. So if you were in Rome, I think it was a species of oak that grew there. They would take those oak leaves and do it. If you were in Athens, it was the laurel tree and the laurel leaves. If you were in Corinth, then it was the Isthmian Games. It was some other kind of plant. I can't even tell what poison ivy looks like, which is why I get into it every year, so don't ask me. But they had these things, and you would win your race, you would finish your race, and they would crown you. There would be a ceremony, right? And they would put this woven leaves on your head, and everybody would cheer, and they would clap, and you would wear that around town, and everyone would know, man, look at that guy. He won. I mean, they were big. They were bigger sports fans than we are about these games. They were crazy about them. I mean, if you had one of those crowns on your head, you were like a god to them. All right? For all the effort and all the things that you put into it. And so it was worth it. No matter what those athletes went through, the training they did, the way that they abstained from certain foods, and the way they just absolutely beat their body into submission, the way that they sacrificed so much. They didn't care about all of that the moment the crown was put on their head. And now James is using that imagery. And he's saying, listen, the crown that Jesus is going to put on you is not this like leaf crown that's just going to brown and age and fade away. The crown that he's going to put on you is the crown of life. The crown of life. Theirs is decaying and fading away, and what he's giving you is going to last forever. And Paul gets at this when he's writing to Timothy at the end of his life, doesn't he? Paul says, I've fought a good fight. I've finished my course. I've kept the faith. Henceforth, there is laid up for me a crown of righteousness, which the Lord, the righteous judge, shall give me at that day, and not to me only, but unto all them that love his appearing. There is a reward for those who finish the race. That's what we're after.
Amen.
God's not waiting for you to fail. He just wants you to finish. He wants you to finish with your faith intact. He wants you to finish still loving him. He wants you to finish believing that it's worth it. He wants you to finish trusting in Jesus Christ. And whether you have to crawl or limp or lean on someone else to get over the finish line, it doesn't matter to him. He just wants you to finish. I think there's too many Christians who have other goals in life than finishing their course.
Yeah.
When I die, I just want to have died before my faith dies. I want this body to expire before my love for Christ and his people expires. I want to finish my job. That's the goal of the Christian life.
Amen.
And too many times there's other things that get in the way. I want to be this and I want to be that, and I want my Christian life to be like this. Hey, listen, believer, you don't get to pick that stuff. But you can finish. You can finish well what God has given you to do. And so you don't need to think about God as being the one who's up there trying to prevent you from finishing. You need to look with hope to the future and see that God is the one who's waiting on the other side, just itching, just waiting to give all those who cross that finish line the crown of life. And so, when you're going through trials, you pick that, you have that picture in your mind so that you can endure that God is waiting to reward my endurance. You say, Pastor, is it okay to have motivation, like a desire to be rewarded? I sure hope so. It's all through the New Testament. Right? Paul talks about, there's nothing wrong with, there's something very wrong about saying, well, I'm going to suffer for Jesus in this life, and then I'll suffer for him more in the next life. That's not the way it works. Right? We live for God, we live for Christ in this life. Right? We experience suffering and sacrifice. The apostle says, I think that, all of these trials that we go through and the suffering of this life, you just can't compare them to the immense weight of glory that's waiting for us. Right? That's what we're doing. And so you're not to quit, but you're to endure. You're to run your race with patience. Now, the second thing that we get into in our text this morning is verses 13 through 18. And here we need to bring in this kind of other idea or other concept, which is this second way that in our English translation, we find the word tempt or temptation. In verse number 12, temptation has to do with the testing. In verse number 13, temptation is an enticement to sin. So verse 13, let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted of God. Verse 12, if you're of the sort that writes in their Bibles, I would circle that word, temptation, and write out to the side, testing. And then when you get to verse 13, I would circle that word and I would write out to the side, enticement to sin. Because this word has to do with your heart and your sin nature and your desires and your affections. This is the word that has to do with what Satan did in the garden to Eve, tempting her to eat of the fruit. This is the kind of word that we usually talk about temptation. This is what we mean, an enticement to sin. Now here's what we're not to say. Let no man say when he is tempted, I am tempted by God. All right, now you're in the midst of this trial, right? And it's kind of like, the trial is squeezing you. And some of the things that are coming out are like squeezing you like a sponge. And some of the things that are coming out of you are not pleasant to behold. How many of you have ever said something that was sinful and that you regretted, and you said it when you were in the midst of a really difficult and trying time? Well, what was happening? Well, what was happening is your life was hard, you were getting squeezed, your self-control was down, your irritability was up, and you let words come out of your mouth that you should not have let come out of your mouth. They weren't to the use of building up or edifying. What happens when we go through trials? When we go through trials, a lot of times we sin. Just being honest here. A lot of times when we go through trials, we sin. Okay? One of the paradoxes of human nature, though, is that sometimes when we go through blessings, we sin too.
Right.
And the reason is because it really has nothing to do with our circumstances and everything to do with our hearts.
Amen.
That's why a change in your circumstances will not result in a change in your life necessarily. Because you can't escape your sinfulness just by changing your circumstances. Why was Jesus successful in resisting temptation? Well, it was not because his life was easy.
Right.
And it was not because he had a really pleasurable set of circumstances in his life. There are at least two times when Jesus was, well, at least one time when Jesus was definitely tempted, another time where we can see the potential of temptation. The first, of course, was when Jesus was driven out in the wilderness, and he hadn't eaten for 40 days. And Satan came to him and tempted him. In all three of those ways that John tells us we are tempted to sin. You know, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Right? Jesus is tempted in these three different areas by Satan, and he is able to resist the temptation, and Satan has to flee from him. I think at least there was a potential for temptation at the very end of his earthly ministry when he's praying in the Garden of Eden and the cross is upon him, and he knows what he has to go through. But he passes that temptation too. Father, if it be thy will, let this cup pass from me. Yet not my will, but thine be done.
Amen.
Most of us have been in a place where it's hard to say that, not my will, but thine be done part. So Jesus was tempted, but Jesus never sinned. He was tired. He was mistreated. He was frequently hungry. He was physically assaulted in terrible and painful ways, and yet all of that without sin. Why? Because he wasn't a sinner. What came out of Jesus when you squeezed him was more righteousness, more love, and more grace, and more mercy. So when something comes out of me, when I'm going through trial, James is going to tell me in this text, not only am I not to blame God for the temptation, but in verse 14, but every man is tempted when he's drawn away of his own lust and enticed. I sin because I am a sinner.
Right.
Every sin I've ever committed originated in my sinful heart.
Right.
I have no right to blame one single person for anything that's ever come out of me that was not pleasing to the Lord. There is no escape from what James is telling us here. Right? You may be telling your friends about something, your spouse, something that happened at work, and you kind of lost your temper, and they love you, and they say something like, "Oh, honey, you know, they just pushed you too far. You know, that was a really hard circumstance." And they say that because they love you, and they're trying to make you feel better. But it's not true.
Right.
I mean, I'm just, sorry. The next time that happens, you're going to be like, "Oh no, I know you're lying to me." The truth of the matter is, if you were as righteous as Jesus, you would not sin no matter what. So it is this aspect of falling short, it is this fact that we are sinful, that sin comes out of us when we are in these trying circumstances. So James says, absolutely under no circumstance are you to blame anything but your own sinful desires. That word, you're drawn away of your own lust and enticed. There's a lot going on in those verses. Drawn away and enticed. The enticement is kind of like the carrot, and the drawn away could be even interpreted as more the stick side. There's this compulsion we have. How many of you say, I fought against that? I tried not to say that. I tried to keep my mouth shut. I tried to be calm. I tried not to get angry. There's almost this violent compulsion that our sin pushes us to. And then at the same time, there's the carrot side of it, where it would feel so good. It would feel so good to just say what I really want to say. It would feel so good to just put this person in their place. It would feel so good to just give into this temptation, whatever it may be. Maybe when you're going through your trial, your temptation is to slip back into some of those carnal habits that medicated you when you were a lost person. When you got through your difficulties with substances, or you got through your difficulties by numbing your brain with meaningless entertainment, or whatever it was you did, you say, I'm gonna just slip back into one of those. It will feel so good to just, do that as you're going through trials. James says, don't blame God for that. God's not the one tempting you. Your temptations come from your own heart, from your own desires. You're drawn away and enticed. He leaves us no wiggle room. No wiggle room to blame somebody else. No wiggle room to say, yes, but Lord, what about him or what about her? And James also includes a warning here, because it's so easy to want to slip back into the flesh. He says, but remember that when lust has conceived, it brings forth sin. And sin, when it's finished, brings forth death. It may be so enticing to give into that temptation. It may be so enticing. You may say, I can't stop myself from doing it. But James wants you to know, if you walk down that path of responding to your temptations as you go through that trial in the flesh, it will always result in more pain and sorrow and death in your life. Let me put it this way. There's never been a time when doing the wrong thing has worked out better than doing the right thing. There's never been a time when by sinning, you have done the right thing. Okay? It's not the way it works. Sin has this tendency to destroy and tear apart and bring death. And in the midst of our trials, we might think, oh, it looks like such a great option to me. It's what I really want to do. This is how I want to respond. And if you do that, James says, you can count on this result in your life. Sin always brings death. No matter how shiny the fruit, no matter how good it looks, no matter how wonderful it might seem to you, it always brings death. We always give into the same temptations and lies, don't we? Generation after generation, we say, yeah, but we can choose this sin and not face the consequences for it. But yet every circumstance of life tells us that sin only brings death. Now contrast that with God. Notice what James is going to do now. He's not going to leave us in this place of death. He says, do not err, my beloved brethren. And now he says, contemplate God. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, and comes down from the Father of lights, with whom is no variableness, neither shadow of turning. Of his own will he begat us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creation. Well, what's going on in this text? James is reminding us, God's not the one tempting us with this corruption. God is the one who has lavished us with the gift of life. Why in our trial will we blame God for bringing us to a point where we want to sin, or tempting us to sin, when everything we know about God is that he only gives the good and the perfect and the beautiful? Every good thing in your life you got from one place. It came from God. Every wholesome, righteous, upright thing was a gift from God to you. So we can't blame God for the temptation to corruption and death and decay when all evidence tells us that God is the one who brings life. In verse 18, he really hammers this point home. Of his own will begat he us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creation. He's trying to get us to understand, in the midst of your trials, you need to remember that God's the only one who's ever on his own, of his own volition, and through no external coercion, brought good into your life. When it says he begat us according to his own will, it means that God's the one who saved you when you didn't even really want to be saved. He loved us when we didn't love him. He chased us when we were rebels against him. He brought us to the cross when we were nailing him to the cross. God's got nothing but good for you. Nothing but life. Nothing but righteousness. And all the good things in your life come from God. So you can't blame him for your sin. Now you may say, preacher, I don't think I've ever blamed God for my temptations to sin. I'm glad you brought that up. Here's how we do that. Adam and Eve, right? Eve sins. God tells Adam, why'd you listen to her? Or why'd you eat the fruit? And what does Adam say? He blame shifts, which is exactly what James is telling us not to do. He says, the woman whom thou gavest to me. Do you notice how he just blamed God for his temptation to sin, but he did it a step away? So what we do, we don't necessarily say that temptation came directly from God, but God, you're the one that put me in these circumstances. And so it's kind of your fault that I'm here with this temptation to sin. And James says, no. That is not right at all. You could be in that circumstance without any temptation to sin if it weren't for your own lusts, your own desires that pull you away from me. So yes, while nobody in this room may have ever directly said to God, how dare you tempt me to sin? I bet an awful lot of times we say, God, it's just not fair that you left me in this circumstance. I just don't, if you would get me out of this, I wouldn't be so tempted to X, Y, and Z. And we blame God for our circumstances, or for our temptations through our circumstances.
So there's a couple ways we need to think rightly about God according to this text. One, we need to understand that God desires us to finish our course. He is not laying stumbling blocks before us. He is not preventing us. He is calling us to the finish line so that he may give us the crown of life, the crown of righteousness. All those that love him can have that. We are to endure until we reach that point. And then secondly, we need to just own our sin as we go through trials. We need to not blame God through our circumstances, but we need to understand in the midst of our trials, no matter what you're going through today, I guarantee you, if you belong to God, there are good and perfect gifts in your life that you need to be thankful for. You need to be focusing not on the things that you don't have, not on the things that you wish were different, not on the things that God has given others and not you. But you need to remember that James says every good and every perfect gift is from above. And if you are a believer today, you live under the blessings not only of Jesus Christ, but even you are living under the fulfillment of all the blessings that have come through redemptive history to Jesus Christ. So the psalmist who knew nothing of Jesus Christ and says, God daily loadeth us with benefits, you can claim that as well. Because every spiritual blessing belongs to you in Jesus Christ. There's a host of reasons to be thankful today. So we've got in mind this idea of approach to trial, and I just have to tell you, don't quit. That's what James is saying. No one ever got crowned for quitting a race. Don't quit. You might get a little tired, you might get a little bruised, you might get a little sore, you might slow down. Don't quit. The trials might not seem to change, but listen, that is a purely earthly perspective.
This life is short and passing away quickly, and so will your trials. You can outlast them. You can make it to the finish line. You just have to endure. You have to be steadfast in the midst of all of that. So I'm going to end with this kind of story of the first martyr that we know of at the Roman Colosseum. Now, there were other martyrs before him. Of course, Stephen was a martyr in Acts 6, and others were martyred for Christ in the book of Acts. But the Roman persecution, the kind where they sort of threw the Christian believers to the wild beasts or the gladiators or stuff. The first one that we know of, could have been others, but the first one we know of, happened right around the turn of the first century, somewhere around AD, I think 106, if I remember right. And a Christian by the name of Ignatius. And they took him to the Roman Colosseum. The Colosseum there is where the Caesars would start their parades. It's where they would have theaters. It's where they would have gladiator fights. And it would be where the emperor would honor those who had served well, or maybe even some who won one of the games, one of the great competitions. You've seen the award ceremony, the medal ceremony for the Paralympics. They bring them up, they got the gold, the silver, and the bronze, and put it on them in this ceremony. Well, imagine this Colosseum, and the emperor has at times brought in, maybe a really famous gladiator who's defeated all his enemies, and people have thrown with flowers and different things, and he's received all these rewards. And maybe the emperor's brought in someone who's won a race, and they've even crowned them with an oak leaf mantle crown and put it on his head. And in that exact same Colosseum where all these people had enjoyed fame, and all these people had enjoyed the honor of the Caesar, the crown that the Caesar could offer, Ignatius goes. He refuses to bow the knee to the emperor. He refuses to say that Caesar is Lord. They arrest him. They're going to throw him to the dogs, to the wild, not just wild dogs, but whatever wild beasts they had. He walks calmly to the Colosseum. He refuses to recant. They throw him in. His body is torn apart by these wild beasts to the point there's nothing left of him but a few of the larger bones, which are gathered up by the Christians and taken to a site where they were kept as relics. But he himself absolutely perishes in that spot. And all the people who are watching at this, they're watching the place where others have been crowned with these laurel, these leaf crowns, and yet here is this man who's literally torn apart and eaten by wild animals in that same spot. And what's really neat, if you could do this in your mind with your imagination, is to see in your mind that they kind of had it exactly backwards. The one man who received an everlasting crown was the man who died terribly in that Colosseum. The man who finished his course. As he died, his Savior received him and said, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant. Enter into the joy of your rest. Here's your crown." And that crown has not gone away, and the rest are all perished. You better choose the ending now, whether you're going to finish your course and endure the trials of life, or whether you're going to settle for what the world has to offer. Would you bow your heads with me today? Before we're dismissed this morning, I do want to just it's been a trying time for many of you.